Happy Sunday, everyone. Today we're talking about church culture. Now, you may remember from a previous musing not too long ago, we were talking about the differences, if they exist, between doctrine and policy. What is doctrine? What is policy? We went deep into it in that musing. Not going to cover that here, only to remind you of President Oakes's quote that encapsulates this perspective that we talked about, where he said, I don't know that it's possible to distinguish between policy and doctrine in a church that believes in continuing revelation and sustains its leader as a prophet. So if you didn't see that musing, go to sundaymusings.org, scroll down just a little bit, you'll be able to find it. So that's policy versus doctrine. Today I want to talk a little bit about culture. Now, I'm going to tease you a little bit and set something up for a little bit later. I'm going to share something later that I only recently came across that I find to be perplexing, if not problematic, as it pertains to culture and how church leadership officially perceives culture. So I'll give the reveal in just a minute. First, I want to talk a little bit about what is this culture stuff that we're talking about. Now, Latter-day Saints, like any group of people, have their own distinct mannerisms and behaviors and practices, right? People of other faiths or people from different ethnic, cultural backgrounds and so forth. We have this culture stuff that comes in of the shared practices and attitudes and things that we all do, right? We're not talking here just about beliefs, because that gets into the doctrinal side. We're talking about the culture and the practices that we're all involved in. Now, I think you could probably break culture down into, there's some praiseworthy aspects of it and then some potentially problematic aspects to our culture. Let's start with the positive. So, regular church attendance. When you look at the data, people who regularly attend church and who are committed and part of a community and serving one another, they're happier, they're healthier on the whole. And those are just the utilitarian benefits of frequent church worship. Of course, we're commanded to do so. It is the doctrine to meet together weekly and to commune and take the sacrament. But that transforms into culture, where you do have a high percentage of Latter-day Saints who do commit to that. And of course, a much higher percentage of people who somewhat regularly go to the church, at least every few weeks. So I think that's a good part of our culture compared to, I remember growing up, our chapel was across the street from a Catholic chapel, and we hardly knew it was there because it was up behind this kind of driveway up on the hill, and there were bushes and everything. You couldn't really see the building, but we did know it was there, or were reminded that it's there every Easter and every Christmas, when the police would have to be out doing traffic control because there were so many cars trying to find a parking spot going up and down the road, lining the side of the road. And that was the kind of acute worship that was participated in by many of these Catholics. Of course, there are Catholics who attend, weekly mass or even more, but by and large, our church culture, I think, is fairly unique. The data bears this out about weekly church attendance, so that's great. Volunteerism, I think, certainly is very high among members of the church. It's a byproduct of having callings, and many people are involved in things for their church community on a volunteer basis. So that's a praiseworthy thing. Of course, an extension of that is informal volunteer service, helping your neighbor, cooking a meal. We just had a neighbor, someone in our family has been sick recently, and so we had a neighbor bring something over and sit and talk with you. That, of course, parlays into what was home and visiting teaching, and then now is ministering. Just this kind of this effort to be aware of one another and finding opportunities to serve one another. Now, personally, I think ministering ought to be organic entirely and not specifically assigned. That's one little that I've always not really liked about the model, but on the whole, it's a positive thing to get people to think about and then care for one another. Missions, of course, I think is a good aspect of our culture, getting out to serve people on a very consistent basis, have a very focused period of your life where you are engaged in learning about and sharing the gospel, where you're focused on service at the exclusion of all other selfish priorities that you might otherwise be doing. Learning a language, learning a new culture for people for whom that's relevant. Certainly, I think that's a praiseworthy aspect of the culture. Again, generally speaking, there's aspects there that we could nitpick at and explore some improvements for. Family history, of course, as a function of temple worship, which is another positive, regularly trying to yearn for the divine, reach higher. Joseph had the quote, or someone said it up, maybe it's a rough stone rolling. I didn't have this written down, but where Joseph was trying to bring heaven down as he was trying to, bring the saints up and kind of bridge the gap and connect the two, and was trying to make heaven more personable and accessible to the saints. And that certainly is a byproduct of temple worship, which gets us in the, spirit of Elijah, thinking about our ancestors and creating one eternal chain, linking all of God's children together through the sealing power. So there's a lot of good aspects of our culture in particular as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm sure we could come up with a much longer list of positive and praiseworthy aspects. Now, it won't be a surprise to any faithful viewer of Sunday Musings that I perceive that there are some potentially problematic aspects of our culture as well. This, of course, is true for any culture. This shouldn't be a surprise. We're not perfect. We're not the city of Enoch. We don't have it all, perfectly packaged and neatly figured out. There are, because we're fallible humans living in a broader culture and society of, secular humanism and idolatry and apostasy and everything else, we are affected by these things, believe it or not. And we like to think that we're, less affected by it than we actually are. I think that we are far more affected by it than we claim to be or let ourselves consider. Of course, when we think of the problematic aspects of our culture, you could break this even into two, just like we have the good and the bad. And among the bad, we've got what you might call the superficial, and then the more substantive. So for superficial, like not having facial hair amongst leadership, that you're expected to, shave your beard if you're called to be a bishop. Like, where does that come from? But that's like a part of our church culture. Beginning your talk by telling everyone how much you don't want to be there giving your talk and how much you tried to avoid the bishopric counselor who was reaching out to you. I think of decades ago in Mormon doctrine when Bruce McConkie wrote about face cards and how for decades it was prevalent in the church to perceive face cards as evil. He, in his book, quoted from Joseph F. Smith, who said just over a century ago, "A deck of cards in the hands of a faithful servant of God is a satire upon religion. Those who thus indulge are not fit to administer in sacred ordinances." Wow. So well over half a century later, Bruce McConkie is passing that on as truthful and accurate, and then goes on in his own exposition to say, don't touch them. And so then, of course, the broader church culture is like, oh, we shouldn't use playing cards, and suddenly playing, blackjack with your kids on a Saturday afternoon with jelly beans or whatever is, somehow sinful. So we get the, same thing with rated R movies. You had an old For Strength of Youth and one or two church talks, and they say no rated R movies, and yet there are plenty of PG-13 movies that are worse than rated R movies of old, and there are some rated R movies that are completely fine. And so outsourcing your viewing habits and your media consumption to the Motion Picture Association of America, some faceless committee of people who don't share your values and who have changing standards and so on and so forth, and yet that becomes part of the church culture. I think superficially, I don't, whatever, it's just a little issue. But you get, like no dating until 16, like this arbitrary age and date, right? You get these cultural things that bubble up, many of which I think are, superficial in the sense that like they don't have significant eternal import and heavy, gravity to them. Then, of course, I think there's some more substantive ones. I think the fact that we avoid contention as much as we do. I was in a elders quorum meeting not too long ago, and the class discussion, the instructor was asking, why do you think Satan wants contention? Why does he want us to be contentious? And the answers were predictable. And I offered a different perspective and said, while it's true, I think that Satan wants us to be contentious, that enmity and animosity is definitely consistent with the outcomes he wants. I don't think that's it entirely. In fact, I think we misunderstand contention. The spirit, the scriptures have positive use cases of the word contend. Contending for God, contending for the kingdom. It's not that all contention is evil. In fact, the Bible doesn't say contention is of the devil, even though that's how it's generally interpreted, I think, by members of the church. Oh, contention is of the devil. We should be nice. We should, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say contention is of the devil. It says the spirit of contention is of the devil. And so I said in my remarks in our elders quorum that I think Satan, Ezra Taft Benson has this great quote. I wasn't prepared to share it here, so I don't remember it, but he basically says, like, if Satan wanted to pacify and paralyze the priesthood, how would he do it? And one way is to say, oh, don't engage in politics, don't engage in these controversial issues. Yeah, there's the proclamation, and yeah, you got all this gender ideology stuff, but don't push back. It's going to cause contention. It's going to alienate people. It's going to cause offense. And so we have this suburban niceness culture. What's the guy, Greg Madsen, I think, on his quick media, he called it teddy bear Jesus, where people imagine in their mind, oh, but the Prince of Peace, and but I've said on a past musing, Jesus did not come to bring peace, but a sword. He stood for truth. Truth is naturally divisive. The guilty taketh the truth to be hard, for it cutteth them to the very center. And so I think one negative aspect of our culture, and a substantive one at that, is that we've embraced suburban niceness culture. We shy away from contention. We don't want to be impolite. And so everyone walks on eggshells, and we don't talk about weighty issues. And because we don't talk about them, we don't equip and empower ourselves to go out Monday through Saturday and take them head on and defend the faith and promote the gospel and stand for truth and righteousness. And so we get this milky, milquetoast, superficial discussion that doesn't engage us in the weightier matters of the law, the substantive issues of our day. And so we're disempowered, we're disengaged, we're paralyzed from the fight. I think, and I concluded my remarks in the class saying, I think Satan thrives when we aren't even contending for Christ, when we aren't even advancing the gospel and defending it in the public square against the spread of these harmful ideas and false doctrines. So again, I think that's a substantive one that is a problem for us in the church. I think correlation, the centralization of all things involving church meetings and curriculum and discussion is all centralized. When you have a multi-billion-dollar massive organization, it gets bureaucracy, it can get sclerotic. And when you have this conformity and uniformity across different cultures and ages and circumstances and whatever, that can, I think, cause some negative cultural issues and disempowering local leaders to have the flexibility necessary to focus on different things that their congregation might need to focus on for the next few months because of some localized issues. So the hierarchy, that aspect of the culture could be problematic. Now, I believe in the gospel. I believe in prophets. I've talked about many times that I think the office, the sustaining of prophet, seer, and revelator is a potential aspirational office or circumstance. It's not a guarantee, just as if when I'm set apart for my calling or I have the priesthood, it doesn't mean I'm automatically receiving all of its spiritual benefits and enlightenment. It's that the potential is there, the pathway is there. So yes, we have modern prophets. I believe that we do. I believe that God has called Joseph and called subsequent prophets, and that we have the access to revelation through them. But that doesn't mean that in all things they are prophetic. Joseph Smith, right? A man is only a prophet when acting as such. I've talked about this in many past musings. I catch a lot of flack for this because our culture very much is follow the prophet. And many of us for decades, since little kids, have been singing follow the prophet, follow the prophet. And this becomes ingrained in our culture to the point where some of us are crushing water bottles because it's what, President Nelson did. There's that quote, I didn't prepare this, but I'm sure heard it, where it's like with a Catholic and they're like, oh, you say that you think your prophet is fallible, but you don't actually believe it. And then the Catholics think that their Pope is infallible, but they don't actually believe it. right? I'm butchering it, I'm sure, but the point is that we create this near deification of quote unquote the prophet, and therefore imbue in everything he says and does some sort of divine stamp of approval, and we lack the nuance and the discernment of when this is truly prophetic and coming from the Lord versus a well-meaning, even inspired opinion or decision, administrative or otherwise. The lack of common consent, the lack of transparency in finances. I've done musings about this in the past. Um, the culture of this perception of unanimity amongst our leaders. One of the most revealing things to me in past years was reading David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, where the author got access to the private meeting minutes and journal entries of David O. McKay, because rather than getting locked away in the First Presidency vault, they landed in the files of his longtime secretary, Claire Middlemiss, who, I'm going off of memory, I think it was like her nephew or some son-in-law is who paired up with the author of the book, and then they used that information as the source to peek behind the curtain and see how much discord and disagreement. These are humans, of course they're going to naturally have disagreements, but you have this culture of there's unanimity, there's and sure, in final decisions that's I'm sure true to arrive at any decision, but we have this culture of there no contention, right? No disagreement, without realizing that behind the scenes, at least decades ago, and as evidenced by that book, but then we can presume even still today, there's fiefdom building, there's power tripping, there's politicking, there's all the things, because we're human. I think again, these are all subsets of the follow the prophet cultural stuff, the prophetic Pokemon, right? Which Pokemon card beats the other one? This prophet said it, a few decades ago, but then this one said it more recently, so this one trumps that one, and so we kind of disregard past leaders' teachings, right? And Elder Haney talked about this in his water bottle talk, right? No one is more important than the modern prophet, and kind of kicking to the curb any past stuff, because it's always about the most recent stuff. Hence why another cultural aspect, rather than focusing on the scriptures so heavily in church, we are just regurgitating and reanalyzing talks from church leaders. And I've talked to many people about this in other wards to try and figure out, is this more my ward? Is it because of Utah? Right? Where you'll go through some lessons, and unless someone in the audience is kind of bringing it up and trying to insert it into the lesson, you'll get teachers who go the entire hour without even cracking open the scriptures, right? And it's like group therapy based on church conference talk as your primary text. So I think that's a problematic aspect. Okay, another potentially problematic aspect of our culture is and this is kind of related to the follow the prophet and all things mentality, is kind of the all is well in Zion aspect of our culture, right? Don't criticize anything. You're studying the ark. You're not allowed to be critical of anything. We're members of the restored gospel. We're doing just fine. So we read in our scriptures, oh yeah, those people who say all is well in Zion. And yet, I mean, the flack that I get, in fact, I think I'll do a future musing on this to dive in a little bit deeper to some of the criticisms that I get for this podcast. The approach that I take, the more critical, I think faith-based critical, but still critical, that's very uncomfortable to a lot of members who have grown up in this culture of saying, don't criticize the brethren, don't presume to know better, don't say anything negative, keep it all in the family, keep it all, quiet. Let's not air our grievances publicly or talk about any of this stuff. And so this podcast itself, in a way, or my style, is rather countercultural, because most people don't want to have these things discussed openly. We're supposed to toe the party line and, kind of keep it quiet, perhaps under the implicit assumption that all is well in Zion. Another aspect of culture I think that's negative is budgetary poverty for local units. The church, centralizes so much of its financial resources at the kind of corporate general level, heavily investing in temple building and so forth. But, consistently, I talk to people who are in bishoprics or elders quorum president or whatever, about the budgetary implications. It's very hard to foster a culture and have, social events and have things that are going to attract people and engage people if you don't have the financial resources to do so. And having such limited budgets creates very limited local, events and opportunities for people to engage. But you all will be free janitors for the church. We got to save every penny where we can, apparently. I think another negative aspect is the misinterpretation of the 12th article of faith and the 134th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, both of which pertaining to our relation to government. Of course, Romans 13 as well is what the general Christians hang their hat on, but we have the Article of Faith 12, D&C 134, and we get this culture of deference to whoever's in charge. We saw this with, President Hinckley and the war in Iraq and everything, right? We saw it with how the church responded to Nazi Germany. You get this general cultural outgrowth of, well, we submit to whoever the political leaders are, and we owe them our allegiance and our deference and our support. And so that's a cultural aspect. It's why the CIA and the FBI and the NSA recruit, among the reasons why they recruit so heavily out of BYU. I mean, certainly there's the dual language aspect and there's the hard work aspect of having served a mission and so forth. But you also get this kind of unquestioning, follow the leader type of culture that leads these individuals to think, well, the government's doing it, we submit to our rulers, and therefore, that's what we do. I think the cultural outgrowth of the misinterpretation of the word of wisdom. Of course, I've done a musing a couple years ago, 3 years ago on this. You go to sundaymusings.org, use the drop down to find by topic any of these, so you could look up word of wisdom. But, saying no to coffee and yes to swig, right? You go throughout Utah and there's lines everywhere, less so in the Starbucks than in the swig and the So Delicious. And, it's like we have our drugs of choice. And we have these, I don't drink coffee, I don't drink alcohol, but I, guzzle energy drinks. It's like, and sugary, beverages and everything. So I think that's a weird aspect of our culture. I mean, we could get into other stuff. There's the, positions on interracial marriage in the past. There's the higher likelihood of affinity fraud amongst members of the church because of this implicit trusting of one another. Elder Holland, in that case, in a speech in 1982, said that it's very easy for people to bridge the gap from unbelievability to believability if church affiliation is used, right? So, the stake president is the, one doing this business. It must be good. Let me invest. Or, my Relief Society president is doing this MLM, right? And you kind of get this blending of capitalism and the church in a way, and it just creates poor outcomes. Okay, so the point of this particular musing is not necessarily to unpack and address all of these cultural issues, both the good and the bad. I want to be very emphatic and clear about that. Culture is not inherently negative. It's not inherently positive. It's not benign. There are positives and negatives about it. And I think we can praise and lean into the positives while talking openly about the negatives. And I could be off base. You could look at half the list that I just shared of negative stuff and say, I think you're looking at it wrong. I think there's actually some positives to that. Here's why. And we could come and reason together and we could talk about it. And maybe I'll agree with you more or you with me more, whatever, right? The point is not that this is like a concrete list of all things bad cultural. It's more to say culture is a mixed bag, and that mixed bag does include, I think, some negative things that we need to talk through and address and work on. And I think anyone who reads the scriptures thinking about the tares amongst the wheat or the foolish virgins, D&C was at 124 saying, upon my house shall it begin, the tribulations of the last days amongst you who should have known better and who have rejected me, right? I think anyone who knows the scriptures would have to concede that there is dysfunction in church culture. Like, I think it's a rare person, if anyone, who would contend that there are not problematic parts of our culture. Now, again, you might disagree and quibble with things in my list. I'm not here to say my list is fully accurate, just to say that we could come up with a list that we would all, or you and I, single viewer, would agree on as negative aspects of our culture that ought to be addressed and remedied. Okay, so with that as a baseline, our baseline being church culture does include some negative things, some even apostate, idolatrous, type of things. Some could be just totally benign and, relatively harmless, but some could be very significant. The church culture of shying away from any discussion about secret combinations and what they look like today, despite being commanded to awaken to our awful situation and not let them give above us. Otherwise, will befall the same fate as the Nephite and Jaredite societies. I think it is a cultural aspect, perhaps connected to the niceness thing, right? Of not wanting to be in controversy, not wanting to dabble in conspiracy, not wanting to get into politics, right? And so that's, I think, a clearly negative aspect with spiritual implications of our church culture. Okay, so with that baseline, the baseline of we're likely all going to agree that there is some subset of our church culture that is problematic, that is spiritually counterproductive. With that baseline in place, I want to share what I was teasing before, and that is an entry in the church handbook as it pertains to culture. This section is 38.8.34, the title of which is Referring to the Church and its Members. Now, this section was newly inserted just a few years ago after President Nelson's address telling everyone to say the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in all cases possible, and stop saying Mormon, et cetera, et cetera. I've talked about this on past musings. I'm not going to delve into detail, but that is the context in which this section of the handbook was introduced. So the handbook discusses the use of the church's name, saying that references to the church should always include the full name of the church when possible. It then goes on to say that Mormon is correctly used in proper names, such as the Book of Mormon, or historical expressions like the Mormon Trail or the Mormon Battalion. It then continues to say that the term Mormonism is inaccurate and its use is discouraged. Okay, so everything up until now is all just about the name of the church and what does any of this have to do with the church's culture? Well, then we get into this part of the same section, and it says the following. When describing the combination of doctrine, culture, and lifestyle unique to the church, the phrase, the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, is accurate and preferred. Huh? So in the context of how to properly refer to the name of the church and our belief system, our community, what names do we use, what terminology do we use? It's in that context that they're saying, all right, now that we've kind of defined the church's name and Mormon and Mormonism, now let's talk about what we mean by the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. And in quotes, right? The restored gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not, according to the church handbook, the doctrine. It is the combination of doctrine, culture, and lifestyle unique to the church, right? I mean, lifestyle, one can accept maybe, right? Behaviors in your lifestyle are kind of an outgrowth of belief. So, the word wisdom, garments, Sabbath worship, right? The belief in those doctrines leads to behavior, your lifestyle, how you live. And so to the extent that those behaviors are consistently in line with the doctrine, then we can say, okay, lifestyle and doctrine, they're kind of, hand in glove, right? But lifestyle can also include traditions of our fathers and, embracing idolatry and embracing mammon and all these things, right? So even the word lifestyle is interesting, and problematic. But culture, the combination of so when you use that term, I believe in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Does that include all things culture? Again, to the extent that lifestyle and culture is directly connected, it's the glove of the hand is the doctrine, and the glove is all the behavioral practices that we engage in. I make a casserole for my neighbor, and I fill out the tithing sheet, and I go serve at the food bank, and I do my calling. Like those behaviors, that's part of our lifestyle, that's part of our culture. So the good stuff, I can say, okay, because culture and lifestyle are necessary outgrowths of the doctrine. Even then, to call the behaviors and practices the restored gospel, maybe. I can see that. Maybe it is a little weird to say that the practices part is the gospel. I think of the restored gospel as being just the doctrine. Like that to me is the cleanest, neatest, and most kind of commonsensical definition of what the gospel of Jesus Christ is. Now, if we say that the gospel is the good news in kind of the broad definition, still, I think that's about ideas. The good news is the doctrine. It's the beliefs. It's the ideas and it's the doctrine. So the practices, the lifestyle, and the culture, I think as necessary implications of one who believes these ideas and these doctrines, but not quite the same. And especially not the negative aspects of lifestyle and culture, which are also unique to the church. Again, I'll read, when describing the combination of doctrine, culture, and lifestyle unique to the church, the phrase, the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, is accurate and preferred. So the handbook does not concede or even acknowledge that there are potentially problematic parts of the culture that is unique to the church. Now, some of the negative culture is not necessarily unique to the church. It's broader Christians, it's broader people in general, it's people in Utah or the United States, right? Like, it's not 100% unique, but to me, it seems a little bit unseemly to lump culture and lifestyle into the definition of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, because from my vantage point and perception, there are negative aspects to our culture that need to be uprooted, that need to be talked about, addressed, moved on past. Let's not do these things anymore. But not all of that culture and not all of that lifestyle is part of the restored gospel. In fact, some of it, much of it, maybe, is inconsistent with the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. So to me, this ought to be amended to include some kind of qualifier, right? The combination of doctrine as well as culture and lifestyle that is consistent and faithful to the doctrine. Then we can say the restored gospel of Jesus Christ and lump in those doctrine-aligned lifestyle habits, cultural practices, and behaviors. So what do you think? Am I making a mountain out of a molehill? Is this as weird to you as it was to me when I first encountered it? When I say the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, I think of the ideas, the doctrines, the truths that have been restored, that have been revealed. I don't think that, when we talk about the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, we're talking about affinity fraud or submitting to our rulers or having boring meetings in church of just milk where the person giving the lesson didn't even really prepare. You get these weird negative aspects of our culture. And again, you can quibble with my list. That's fine. I'm not here to say that you all must agree with my list, nor that it's my complete list, both on the positive and the negative side. But I think we can all agree that not every aspect of our culture is completely in tune with the Lord's restored truths and doctrines. Therefore, my preferred definition of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ is to limit it to the doctrines, just because when we're dealing with fallible humans, there is going to be some mix of idolatry and apostasy and cultural creep from surrounding, peoples that God's people throughout history have always struggled with again and again. Many of you know I've been working on this book, The Slow Stain, and when I was doing the research for it, looking at all the Israelites, the Nephites, the Jaredites, the early Christians, the early Latter-day Saints, and looking at all these people and how they struggled to resist the cultural surroundings, the beliefs, behaviors of those people. We're not immune from that. And if we think we are, if we don't realize how susceptible we are, that's like we're already mired in it without realizing it, because all those people deluded themselves into thinking, oh, we're righteous, oh, we're doing just fine, all the while embracing these ideas. And we are just as susceptible to that creep, right? And that's the problem with culture, is that oftentimes it's so incremental and it's so normal, right, that you don't even really realize it's not this intentional, conscious act that I'm going to embrace that idolatrous thing and incorporate it into my belief system. It's always this kind of slow stain of the world. And we're guilty of that too. I know we are. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't identify the stains in our day, how in the world are we going to resist them? How in the world are we going to counteract them and apply stain remover if we don't even realize how this stain is kind of slowly saturating and creeping towards us? That is my concern. So the codification of church culture, there's some good, there's some not so good. I think we need to talk a little bit more, as I like to do, which makes a lot of folks uncomfortable because it's countercultural in our church culture, to talk about what are some of these potentially negative things and then how can we improve them. For me, it comes from a place of love, right? I love the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, right? I love the church and what it stands for, the potential that it has, and my membership in it, and the opportunity to fellowship with one another and try and live out and discuss these doctrines, right? And it's because I want to strive for adhering to the commandments, to aspiring to do what Jesus said, that I look around and I realize how imperfect I am and how flawed I am and how fallen we are and how much we're struggling as a church community. I mean, even Joseph Smith, right, was talking about again and again how he struggled to get things into the minds of the saints, to get them to adopt different behaviors and practices. He had the quote about trying, what is it like with the pumpkin beetle, with the corn dodger and the hemlock knot. He's trying to break a knotted, thick stump of wood with like a piece of cornbread and a pumpkin as a hammer. Like, you can't do it. But he's making the point that even back then he's struggling. Are we any better today? I don't think so. And I think in some respects we're worse, right? You don't have the prophet Joseph Smith in your midst receiving active revelations and all these things like with such regularity and daily relevance and application. So I think we struggle, and I think we struggle more than we let on and than we realize. And therefore our culture becomes corroded to some degree. Again, we can differ on what that looks like, but to me, that's not the restored gospel. If anything, striving to adhere to the restored gospel means identifying and purging those traditions of our fathers and the idolatry and the apostasy, and being cognizant of aspects of our culture that are inconsistent with the doctrine. But that requires us to talk about it. How in the world are we going to identify what those things are if we're not willing to talk about it, which may cause contention, right? It may make some people upset. It may look unflattering to church members and or leaders. It may be perceived as steadying the ark by people who are not used to talking with any critique about any of these issues, right? But I think it still needs to happen. And I think the short-term pain produces long-term gain. If we can talk more about this, focus more on it, uproot and rid ourselves of it, then we will be a more righteous society. But if we don't, if we continue to bury it, set it aside, all is well in Zion, too contentious, etc., we know where this leads. The scriptures are very clear about that. And we can delude ourselves into thinking that we're not sliding down the path of apostasy, but that's not what history would tell us. We'll wrap there. Let me know in the comments what you think. Did I miss anything? You quibble with my list. Did you know about that handbook entry? What are your thoughts? I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you next Sunday.